The aim of this assessment is for you to practically apply the knowledge and understanding that you have gained from your studies. To do this, you'll need to complete a risk assessment. You'll identify hazards, evaluate risks, and recommend further controls, actions, and measures. The risk assessment you produce must be completed within a workplace environment. If you cannot use your workplace, you may volunteer at a local business or in a workplace owned by friends or family. This may sound like a lot, but don't worry. We will now outline this process from start to finish. Let's start with the basics. When completing your assessment, you must use the official risk assessment template supplied by NEBOSH. You will have 10 working days to complete your assessment, but we recommend you take around 3 hours to complete all parts of the assessment. This is a pass or refer assessment. Once you have completed and submitted your examination, you will receive your results within 50 working days. Once you have your result, you will receive the examiner's feedback within 48 hours. Before we break down the assessment in detail, let's look at some tips you should keep in mind before starting. Take the time to read the guidance document in full before you start your assessment. It is very important that you fully understand what is required of you to complete this risk assessment. You may also want to look through the NEBOSH example risk assessment. This will give you a good idea of what you are expected to produce for this assessment. When you are ready to start, please make sure that your name and learner number are in the footer section of your assessment. This information should also be used when naming and saving your examination. You must paint the picture for the examiners. Include as much detail as possible so that the examiner can easily visualize your assessment. This is a common mistake we see in this assessment. Every single column must have an entry. If you have nothing to add, please leave an NA so we know it's not been left by mistake. Leave nothing blank. You should always read your work again before you submit. You should check it is clear and that it is detailed yet still concise and simple to understand. Now let's look at the risk assessment in more detail. The risk assessment is divided into 4 parts. Part 1, background and general description of the organization. Part 2, the risk assessment. Part 3, prioritize 3 actions with justification. And Part 4, review, communicate and check. Part 1 is where you'll give the background details of the organization. You will need to give the name and location of the organization, a general description of the organization, and a description of the area to be included in the risk assessment, as well as the number of workers and any other relevant information. When it comes to the general description, please be as detailed as possible. Remember to paint the picture for the examiner. Your description should include the following points: shifts, working hours, types of services, types of products, and types of activities. We've noticed that learners tend to miss out some of these points, especially shift patterns. Please explain each one of these points in detail. The final section of Part 1 is about how the risk assessment was carried out. Please note that this part can only be completed at the end after the entire risk assessment has been completed in full. This includes parts 2, 3, and 4. When you come back to this section after completing the assessment, you must ensure that you separate and explain each point in detail based on what you did to complete this risk assessment. These points are the sources of information, who you spoke to, and how you identified the hazards, what is already being done, and additional controls. Sources of information consulted. Consider both types. Internal sources used. Visual inspections. Why did you use this and how did it help you complete the risk assessment? Internal audits. Consulting with workers. External sources used. This is where you have to list all the legislation you have used throughout your risk assessment. If you have consulted a specialist. If you have reviewed external audits. Who you spoke to. Make a list of all the types of people you have spoken to throughout the risk assessment. With each one, explain why you spoke to them and the impact they made on the risk assessment. How you identified the hazards. Give different ways of how you identified the hazards, i.e. visual inspections, speaking to workers, etc. And then explain how they helped you identify hazards. What is already being done? Here you need to look at ways you identified what was already in place while referring to column 3 of part 2, i.e. visual inspections, and how you identified any additional controls or actions that may be required. Here you need to explain how you found the further controls in column 4 of part 2, i.e. use legislation, use the management system. For part 2, you will need to complete a risk assessment based on the area you have chosen within your workplace. You must find and record a minimum of 10 different hazards. We advise you to record between 12 and 15 different hazards, but no more. The reason we advise more than 10 is that if you were to only record 10 and one of the 10 is deemed incorrect, the whole assessment will be marked as not met. These hazards must be taken from at least 5 different categories. The hazard categories are the topic headings from elements 5 to 11 of your syllabus. Each hazard in your risk assessment must include details on the following points. The hazard and hazard category. Each hazard and hazard category must be stated within its own row, clearly separated. You can reuse the hazard category if you wish, however the hazard must be within its own row. Who might be harmed and how? Separate the two requirements. Who? You need to list the types of people and how many of those people can be harmed by the hazard mentioned in column 1. How? This one has 2 parts needed. You explain how the hazard can harm the people mentioned above, and then consequences, types of injuries that could occur due to this. What you are already doing to control the hazard. Here you need to make a list of things that are already in place that exist to eliminate or reduce the risk. With each control already in place, you need to explain briefly how it reduces the risk. If no current controls in place, state NA. Ensure you separate each control with clear spacing or bullet points. What further controls or actions might be needed? It is vital that you make use of the hierarchy of control. Do your research and make sure you have a reasonable amount of controls. The examiner wants to see that you are able to reduce the risk and use the hierarchy of control. Do not worry about the business aspects such as budget, only consider health and safety. For example, if a new crane would significantly reduce the risk but would cost £10 million, still put it in here. The risk assessment is about finding ways to reduce. In part 3, we will consider other aspects. You need to ensure that you provide enough controls between column 3 and 4 to show that the risk level is adequately controlled or eliminated if possible. Therefore, provide as many controls as you can. You should also ensure that your controls are written in the future tense. Installer, for example. This will ensure it reads clearly as something that still needs to be put in place. What are the timescales for completion of the action? Make sure every additional control has its own timescale. Give actual timescales, such as 2 days, 2 weeks, 3 months. Steer away from words like immediately, continuous, monthly. When something is continuous, you need to first give the timescale of the first one and then thereafter, i.e., 2 weeks, continuous once every week. This is done in cases such as inspections. The role of the person responsible. Make sure every additional control has its own responsible person. In Part 3, you need to choose 3 actions from Part 2, Column 4 that will make the most significant difference to the risk level. These actions can be associated with the same or different hazard/hazard categories. Before justifying your 3 chosen actions, you will give moral, general legal, and financial arguments for all actions. Explain in detail why it is important, morally, legally, and financially to complete all of these actions. You now need to justify your 3 chosen actions individually. The first section is the action. What you write in this section needs to be taken exactly from what you have written in column 4. The next section is where you need to support your action with specific legislation. The third section is about considering the likelihood and severity of the hazard. In this section, you should include types of injury or ill health, number of workers at risk, how often the activity is carried out, and how widespread the risk is. And finally, you need to explain how effective you believe the action is likely to be at controlling the risk. Your explanation should include the intended impact of the action, justification for the timescale, and whether you think the action will fully control the risk. Complete these steps again for your 2 remaining chosen actions. The final part of this assessment is about reviewing, communicating, and checking. In this part, you will set a realistic review date for the risk assessment and explain why you have chosen this date. You will indicate how the findings of the risk assessment are to be communicated and with whom, and indicate how you will follow up the risk assessment to check that actions have been carried out. We wish you the best of luck with your assessment.